Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Columbia Business School's Executive Webinar Series. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Why Strategy is Everyone's Job. We're very happy and lucky to be joined today by two of our professors, Willie Pietersen and Peter Meola, both of whom teach in our Creating and Executing Breakthrough Strategy program, as well as a number of other programs here at Executive Education. And Peter, if you're there, feel free to go kick it off.
This is Willie Pietersen. I'm the one kicking it off. Greetings to everybody. I'm very happy you joined in. As I've said, my name is Willie Pietersen, and I'm Professor of the Practice of Management at Columbia Business School. Before we launch off, Gershom, can I ask you how many folks have joined us?
Of course. We have almost 200 people joining us today from all across the world.
Wonderful, wonderful. So thank you so much for joining in. Let's make this worthwhile for everybody. So let's launch into the topic. Let me start by saying that the way that organizations create their future is through the strategies that they pursue. But if a strategy exists only at the top of an organization, it cannot produce unity of action, which is really the ultimate purpose. So to be effective, an organization's strategic priorities must be translated and acted on at every level in an organization. Now, inescapably, this means that strategy is everyone's job. So our main discussion agenda today is to examine how strategy applies to you in your particular role, whatever it may be. But unfortunately, strategy is a largely misunderstood and misapplied concept. So the first order of business for us is to just briefly demystify what strategy is and what it isn't. So here then are the two questions that we will address in this brief seminar. Number one, what is strategy and why do we need it? And then the second question, of course, is derived from this. Second question is, how does strategy apply to us in our everyday work, regardless of where we work in the system? So let's begin by addressing these threshold questions. What gave birth to strategy and why do we need it? As Aristotle said, if you want to understand something, you should first understand its origins. So here's the simple answer. There's only one reason why we need to have a strategy in the first place. And that reason is the reality of limited resources, which in turn leads to the fact of competition. So what strategy is at its essence is the necessary response to this inescapable reality of limited resources. So Gershon, if you could put the slide up at this point so that I could just give up. This is my one-page summary of the essence of strategy. So just think about this issue that I've just mentioned of limited resources. If we had unlimited resources, we wouldn't need to have a strategy. We could just keep hurling resources at our problems, and our survival would be guaranteed. We would eliminate all risk of failure, and competition would become irrelevant. Now, such a world doesn't exist. Regardless of the size of the company or even a country, there's no such thing as unlimited resources. Now, this reality of limited resources has pretty harsh consequences. The allocation of our resources is a zero-sum game. Every additional thing we do takes away effort from everything else we do. So this takes us to the essence of what strategy is all about. It's about making the best choices on how to focus our scarce resources to achieve competitive advantage. You know, that slips off the tongue. Making choices sounds easy and straightforward, but let's examine that for a minute. Here's a rhetorical question. What is a choice? Now, the answer is that it's not a choice unless you decide what you will give up. That's the heart of choice making. It's an act of sacrifice. And this means being clear about what you will and will not do. Otherwise, you're just piling it on, and you end up strangling your organization. Now, here's a quick example for you of somebody who I think was very good at choice making and this point of excluding items, and that was Steve Jobs. He's often written about, of course, and often we talk about his wonderful creative capability and his ability to interpret customer needs, but a lesser noted item, but actually was his paramount capability, was his ability to make choices and determine what not to do. Walter Isaacson wrote a wonderful book on this and really emphasizes this point. Here typically is what he did. He would ask 15 teams to pursue a set of separate ideas in terms of mapping the future. Then when they got together after about 3 months of study, he and his executive team would listen to the presentations, and at the end of it, he would pick 3 out of the 15 and abandon the other 12. And of course, the people who'd sweated away working on them would say, oh, I don't want to let go of my favorite topic. Perhaps we put it on the back burner. And Steve Jobs' answer was, there is no back burner. Everybody here will work on these 3 things, and we will abandon the other 12. So it's kind of a unique capability, and Apple today still has a much simpler and restricted product line than its competitors. So this is a key capability, making choices. But strategy creation is not just a process of open-ended choice making. The aim is to answer 3 very important questions. The answers to these 3 questions will shape the destiny of your organization. You see there under item 3 what these questions are, and they build on each other in a sequence. Question 1, where will we compete and what is our aim? We first have to determine our competitive arena before anything else. That's the sort of overarching choice. Then the second question becomes, how will we win the competition for value creation in our chosen arena? This is what we call our winning proposition. That's the heart of our strategy. And the third, which builds on the winning proposition, is what will be our key priorities for success. So you'll note how these questions build on each other in one kind of integrated set. Now, without clear answers to these 3 questions, we can't claim to have a strategy. Everything an organization does must cascade from the answers to these 3 questions in a process of translation through all the layers of the system. So that's where you come in, and we'll explore that further. But let's look at the final point in our summary, item 4. In a changing environment, we need to apply a dynamic process for creating winning strategies and renewing those strategies as the environment shifts. The final analysis, this is our only route to a sustainable competitive advantage. And the process that we'll be talking about here is called strategic learning. It involves a shift of gear from strategy as planning to strategy as learning. And Peter Meola, my colleague, will briefly review that in his comments. So what I'd like to do now, having done that very brief summary of what strategy is, what its essence is, what its content is, and the need for it to be translated through the system, is I'd like to show you a brief video, which is an explicit examination of the role strategy plays in everybody's daily work. It's a 5-minute video entitled Why Strategy is Everyone's Job, and it's a mini lecture I gave on a program. So I'll ask Gershon to get that rolling for us.
Whose job is it in your organization to create a strategy? And what's your role in the process? It may be, as you've been watching this, that you considered yourself to be maybe a spectator, that you watch it happening, but not really truly involved because of your particular role. may feel that it doesn't apply specifically to you. It's not part of your leadership challenge, not expected of you, don't get rewarded for it. It may be that you're a critic, that the strategy gets announced and you look at it and you ridicule it maybe, or criticize it, or maybe you're a cheerleader and say, great, let's all do this together. Or are you a participant? Now, what I want to offer you is this. I believe, and I want to illustrate, that strategy is everybody's job. Later on, I'm going to be talking about profit. And the same question will arise. Whose job is it to make money in an organization? Everybody's job. We can't point fingers and say, you make money and I'll just do my thing. And the same thing is true of strategy. If we're going to be coherent as an organization and fully aligned, it's everybody's job, and it's an important aspect of your leadership. So let me illustrate my point. Winning at value. Here's the way I'd like you to think about this. Let's assume you're working in a subunit, either in a function or in a business unit that generates revenue. But somewhere in that organization, maybe you're not at the corporate level, you're not the CEO. Let's assume for a moment that that's your role. The first task that I'd like you to consider is a line of sight to what your corporation is aiming to achieve. Don't start by doing a strategy for your own unit. You're not an island unto yourself. You're not a separate independent unit. First task, line of sight. What is our corporation aiming to achieve? What are its strategic goals? Then translation down into how your subunit will create a winning proposition and key priorities and do the necessary situation analysis to get there that is in total alignment with the corporation's goals. That is acting strategically on the goals established by your corporation. That's how value generation occurs. Now, some people might argue, I don't know, the corporation's not clear on the goals. I'm afraid I can't do that. And then we begin to sound a bit like a victim. Whose job is it to create clarity for your organization? It's an essential leadership task. You owe it to your people. You have to get clarity. It won't descend from the blue sky and sit in your lap and stroke your head and say, hello, my name is Clarity, I'm for you. You have to go get it. You have to discuss with your boss, your supervisor, whatever it is. Discuss, write down a few things. Say, are we on the same page? Because my job is to translate those goals into effective strategy where I work. That is our job as strategic leaders. Let me offer you a metaphor to help you remember this. Think about 3 workmen toiling away on a sidewalk, and you walk past, and you're intrigued, and you say to the first one, what are you doing? And he says, I'm digging a hole. The second one, what about you? What are you doing? I'm laying bricks. And the third one, and you, what are you doing? And he says, I'm building a cathedral. Your job as a leader is to define the cathedral and be able to say to the person digging a hole, to give meaning to his work, you're not just digging a hole. You are establishing strong foundations. So this cathedral will stand for 1,000 years. There's meaning in your work. And you say to the guy laying bricks, you're not just laying bricks, you're creating a beautiful facade. So people will come from faraway places to admire our work. That's the cathedral. The military has the same thing. It's called commander's intent. What is our ultimate purpose? And then you translate down if you're a field commander or in one of the units. But you're not an isolated element. Final point then, some of you might say, oh, well, that's interesting. But it doesn't apply to me because I work in a cost center. Well, I think that's the wrong way to look at your job. If you regard your job as a cost center, you have only one task. And everybody's going to expect you to deliver on that task. That's to lower your costs. Turn that around. Tell yourself you work in a value center, not in a cost center. Now what's your task? Is to create greater value than the costs you incur. And the conversation with those inside your organization are totally different. It starts with value. It describes value. It taps into their needs. This is what I'm going to do for you. And my job is to demonstrate that the value I generate is higher than the costs I incur. Otherwise, you're destroying value. And you say, what am I competing against? Maybe these internal customers don't have alternatives. Well, mentally they do. We're always competing against something. There are external benchmarks of excellence that tell you how you're doing, so that you always are generating greater value than the costs that you incur. I think that's the way we need to think about our jobs as strategic leaders. It's all of our jobs. Nobody's accepted from that role. None of us are spectators. We're all active participants.
Peter, are you on the line?
As Willie alluded to earlier, I'm a colleague of Willie's. I'm a professor of executive education here at Columbia. And what I'd like to do is just initiate a little bit of discussion upon reflection of both that tape and Willie's comments earlier on. I'd like you to think about these two questions. One being, what might be your questions for clarification or other interests? Certainly there maybe have been something in the tape which certainly wasn't perfect, unfortunately, but if you have any questions for clarity, we'd certainly be more than happy to help you there. And secondly, what key opportunities do you see to create and execute breakthrough strategies more effectively within your domain of accountability in your professions? It's a good question because it allows you to sort of step back and say, well, basically what I've heard today is a summary of potentially how things should be. How does that contrast with my own environment and to the extent in which, in the way strategy is actually developed and executed? And as you think about those questions, I'd like to give a little bit of color based on our own experience with clients and students as we've taught this material over the course of many years. I would bucket the challenges typically in three areas. Whether or not these apply to you or not, I don't know. I'd ask you to think about that. The one challenge has to do with a majority of companies have a planning bias versus a strategy bias. What we mean by a planning bias is most time, resource, time, and attention is spent around creating budgets and activity sets and actually doing things and executing. A strategy bias is a corporation that first and foremost makes strategic choices based on their evaluation of the broader environment and what it's going to take to win. A lot of research has been done around this, and I'd say roughly 80% of all organizations have a planning bias and or group the activity of planning with strategy as one as opposed to separating the two. And as Willie alluded to, they're two very, very different things. Planning is around budgets and putting together activity sets. Strategy is about choice making. And first things first, strategy should always come before planning and in fact should be separated in terms of process if you want to get the purity and the best effect associated with both of them, which are mutually interdependent. So that's number one. I'd ask you to reflect on your own organizations. Do you have an overly planning bias organization and you're not spending enough time around strategy first and foremost? The other area where challenges typically are in cultural barriers in organizations. And I'd like you to think about three areas here. One is the notion that conditions today won't change. You have this culture and this orientation in an organization which says, you know, we're doing pretty well today, and the conditions that exist are supporting our success. I really don't believe or don't want to believe the potential for things changing. We call this the Parmenides Fallacy. It's basically the notion that you don't believe that change will actually happen. And that has a very, very dangerous implication. It causes organizations not wanting to learn, quite honestly. And the question of sustainability of these organizations comes into question if you're not able and willing to actually learn from and understand that change does occur. It occurs all the time. That's number one. The other cultural area that I'd like to talk about is the idea of confirmation bias. And that's where, you have a culture in an organization which is permeated by the orientation which says, I already know what I want to do and what's going to be successful, and now what I'm going to do in terms of the process is just look for information that substantiates what I already believe. And that equally has a very negative implication, because what it does is it puts a cap on your learning as an organization. And it's very dangerous because you're not giving yourself a chance to learn, interpret, and then devise a winning strategy associated with the marketplace actually is allowing you. And then the third area associated with cultural barriers is the perception that strategy, and as Willie talked about this, the misperception, I should say, that strategy is only for the most senior of executives. That's also a very dangerous orientation, because it diminishes and doesn't give full value to the notion that organizations that are successful are the organizations that are best at promoting unity of action. And unity of action means unity of strategy and interpretation throughout the organization. So I'd ask you to think about those three areas associated with cultural barriers. Do any of those exist in your organization that you may need to deal with? And then the third one, big barrier or challenge I would suggest, is simply my organization lacks the core process of learning, strategy development, and execution. If you go to 5 different areas or departments of an organization and ask them what is their strategy development process, in many cases you might find 5 very different definitions of strategy and 5 very different processes for which strategy is actually developed. And what happens is every time the notion or the want to develop strategy takes place, they reinvent the wheel. The power of a common language in an organization associated with strategy, not only its definition, but the methodology and some of the fundamental principles of the methodology, is very, very important, because as one organization you speak the same language, and when you're dialoguing, whether it's for strategy development or through execution, having that common language is very, very productive. And you're spending time actually creating and executing strategy, as opposed to spending time figuring out each time what the definition is and how we're going to go about it. So I'd ask you to think about those comments a little bit and reflect on your own organizations, your own domain of accountability, and maybe share with us what you see to be some of the key opportunities to create better strategy within your organization. So we'll take some questions at this time. You can just, I guess, Gershon, we'll just have them type them in as we go.
Yeah, if you have any questions, please type them in the Q&A section. We've actually got a few questions have already come in, a number of questions.
Okay.
So one that's come up in a few people's comments is the idea of what would you suggest somebody does if they're in an organization with competing strategies, and their unit, they're trying to lead in some strategy from where they are, but their unit feels like it's being bounced back and forth. One person described it as being a football being tossed between the powers that be. How do they help make it better for everybody, I guess?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of thoughts here. One is that for any organization to really operate at their peak, it's very important to get clear what the higher order strategy is in the organization. So the first question I would have for that person to ask is the higher order strategy absolutely clean and clear in terms of answering the questions, who we're going to target, how we're going to win, and what are our priorities? If that is the case, then the next question simply has to be, in terms of the operating units that are contributing to that broader strategy, is what is your strategy based on your interpretation of what the organization is trying to do at the next level. If the question is you don't believe in the higher order strategy, well, that's a different challenge in an organization, and that may be above your pay grade, quite honestly. There may be a time and a place where you can challenge an input to that higher order strategy, but at some point, good leadership is going to want to ask the whole organization to get behind what they deem to be the higher order strategy. And if that is the case, once you do that, then you need to, within your individual operating units, departments, et cetera, teams, is to align with that and come up with a winning strategy which is associated with your contribution to the whole. Willie, do you have anything more to add to that?
Well, that's well said. I think the task is to develop a line of sight to what the organization is trying to achieve, and often that's a bit murky and unclear. So continuing that dialogue, writing down some notes, checking that with the folk at the more senior levels until you're on the same page, and then translation down. You know, it's a typical thing in leadership that we have to clarify what commander's intent is, the ultimate purpose of the organization, and then translate down. And that's, that's a big motivational factor as well. As Nietzsche said, people will do almost any what if you give them a good why. So just addressing that higher end purpose is critical.
Very good. Gershom, any other questions?
Yes, lots of questions coming in.
Okay.
So the next one, there's again a few people have asked similar questions. Given that the world everyone is operating in is changing all the time, at what point does a flexible strategy become no strategy at all?
Well, the short answer is you should always have a strategy. Okay, you should always have a strategy. And today more than ever, our external environment and the influences of the external environment are moving faster and faster and challenging our organizations. So the idea of having core competency within an organization to continuously sense and respond, interpret the implications of those environmental impacts in terms of the choices that you're making in your organization, which is defined as a strategy, is a capability that has to be flexible more than ever. Okay, more than ever. So, call a flexible strategy a changeable strategy, and that's what it is. But you flex it only when you read impacts in the organization, in the broader environment, that are significant enough to change the choices you make associated with the customers you're targeting, the arenas you compete in, how you're going to win, and what the priorities are. So I wouldn't want you to be blinded by the challenge associated with a very fast-moving organization. What I want you to do is stay very true to a couple of principles. One is you always need a strategy, and you need to change it as often as it is important to change it. And number two is you better have the competency in your organization to do so. Willie?
Yeah, that's well said. Nothing more to add.
Okay. Next one.
All right. Then, let's see. There's a lot of good questions coming in. A lot of questions about communicating either a change in strategy through the organization, and then also specifically how you help people at specific roles and tiers at the organization understand the strategy. Do you have any sort of, I know you addressed this a little earlier, any thoughts on what the most effective ways of communicating that strategy is?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a whole industry that's out there in terms of different mechanisms and forums in which you begin to expose the deep organization into the higher level strategy of an organization. I will tell you, though, based on our experience, one of the best ways to get people to understand the strategy is to have them involved in actually its development. Now, if you're running a big, multi-layered, multi-geography corporation organization, that's an impossibility. That being said, however, the process by which you then go and have line of sight and then interpret the development of your local strategy is an important piece of ownership, not just emotionally, but also intellectually, in actually having made a contribution to the thought process, you internalize the understanding of what that strategy is all about. Really important. Now, in terms of exposure to the higher level of strategy and what it means, okay, there are many different mechanisms. I like one which brings people together, exposes them to the rationale, substantiation, and then the choices of a higher order strategy, but then gives people the opportunity in those forums to reflect on it and answer the question, what the heck does this mean for me? So you can do that at tables and breakouts and then report back in. But the more you can get people to begin to internalize that strategy and what it means for them, the more firepower you're going to generate within your organization in terms of mobilizing. The better people can understand the implication it has for them and their operations, the better off you're going to be. That's the objective in any form of communication. Willie?
I can just add to that and just point of emphasis here. The final deliverable of a strategy is not just a document. It's a leadership message that translates the document so that it lives in the hearts and minds of everyone and generates passion and commitment. You know, there are always in this communication, the leadership message, there are 3 questions in the minds of all employees, and we have to address those 3 questions. Question 1, what are we trying to achieve and why should I care? Question 2, where does my department fit in and what's expected of me? Question 3, how will we measure success and what's in it for me? And we really have to address all 3 of those if we're going to expect commitment and passion behind the strategy.
Very good.
Great.
You know, it's interesting. I was just going to add to that as well. I was doing some reading over the weekend, and this is some research that was done only here in the United States, so you need to take it with a grain of salt in that sense. But there are some broader learnings. They did a survey of 18,000 young Americans, students, etc., between the ages of 15 and 29, and they asked them to rate who would be their preferred employer. Based on what's available today out there. And as you might imagine, Google was number 1. Number 2 was Walt Disney. Number 3 was St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. And number 5 was the FBI. And number 7 was Microsoft. Number 8 was the CIA. The idea and the notion, Willie was talking about the Cathedral and finding a way for any organization to communicate to their organization that the strategy is about delivering on a higher order, okay, a higher order improved society in some way, shape, or form, making a broader contribution, getting them emotionally bonded to what the purpose is and the vision of the organization is very important. And that's what this article went on to say is these are all organizations. I don't want to say they're companies because they're not companies all the time. These are all organizations that have done a pretty darn good job at clarifying the broader motivation around what we want to do and how we're going to make the world a better place in some way, shape, or form. You may disagree with some of them, and everybody is entitled to their opinion, but that was the notion that the nature of the companies that were cited high on the list did an excellent job in actually portraying and articulating what the Cathedral was, if you will, what the Cathedral was. So I thought I'd just pass that on. That just came out this weekend, so I thought you might find that interesting. Gershom, anything else?
I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
This came in, this person's actually asking about nonprofit organizations, but I think it applies more generally, asking about times when a change of strategy might be seen negatively by other stakeholders in the organization, and managing the reception, the potential for bad reception of a change of strategy.
First things first, it's so important. It gets back to my earlier comments, I think. The more you can get people involved in strategy development or strategy evolution, and giving them a say in some of the choices or informing those choices is an important first step, because they begin to understand not just what the choices were, but the reasons why the choices were made. And if you've gone beyond this already and you're having some problems with the organization, I would just suggest, I'd ask myself the question, have I given them enough reason to believe why this change in strategy or why this strategy is something that they should support? You know, the old image of a senior executive coming out of their corner office, they don't exist anymore, I guess, going out there with waving the document that Willie was alluding to, saying, here's the new strategy, now I want you all to love it, isn't exactly the most motivating approach to an organization. So spending the time not only sharing the choices, but at least as important, sharing the rationale and the substantiation goes a long, long way. So I think that's the best answer I have for there. Willie?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think the logic is always outside in and not inside out. So the logic for any change in a strategy is what's happening out there in the marketplace and the competitive factors that need to be in place for us to win. So that's it. If we start going inside out and ask ourselves, what should we do? That question goes nowhere, because the outside world doesn't really give a damn what we do. They care only about what they get, and that's what customers expect to receive as superior value.
Gotcha. So Gershon, why don't we go to the last slide? We don't want to keep these folks any longer than we have to. And what I just want to do is spend a couple of minutes just reviewing with you some of the rough content of the course that Willie and I teach, Creating, Executing Breakthrough Strategies. And what you see in the bottom right is what we call the strategic learning cycle, which is really the complete cycle in which we review in the course, which goes from everything from the situation analysis and sensing and responding to the external environment to actually making choices and how you make choices and what's a good choice versus not such a good choice. And then it continues all the way down and through, which includes how do you then build alignment in the organization amongst your people and the process to support the choices that you've made in the organization. And importantly, in some of the questions that you folks raised, how do you then do it time and time again? Because obviously the world doesn't stop, and the challenges and the environmental impacts don't stop. So what we do is we take you through this sequence of this cycle throughout the course of the week. We start on a Sunday afternoon and we go through a Friday lunchtime. And we take you through the principles, the frameworks, the orientations, so that you can build a actual language and a way of not just setting strategy, but executing strategy that could ideally be embedded within your organization as a common way of doing this. So as you see what I wrote here, we talk to the elements of not just strategy creation, but strategy and execution. And we take you through the cycle by offering you concepts, importantly tools, to actually implement and utilize in developing your answers to the questions associated with each piece of the cycle. We both have a lot of experience, not just teaching, but in our previous lives as senior executives across a number of different industries. So we share a number of examples and cases, not just from the past, but also what's going on in the world today with a lot of different organizations that have become incredibly new, unique, and taking advantage of what the world has to offer today. We also, throughout the week, beyond simply the concepts and the tools, we give you an opportunity to actually work a case in plenary, which is a biomed pharmaceutical case where we work together and actually apply the tools and the methodology across the strategic learning cycle to actually build a strategy for this organization. So we get to work together in plenary on that. And then the other piece is you bring with yourself as well to the class your own personal strategic challenge to begin to develop a strategy to address that challenge. And we do that You do that in groups throughout the week with co-workers, if you will, who are attending the seminars, and also Willie and I help you with some coaching associated with that. So you're not only getting casework, but you're also getting personal work associated with some of the challenges that you might be experiencing. So you're actually applying this learning very, very quickly. We always have truly a diverse and experienced group of attendees from all over the world. So the diversity comes from not only geographic backgrounds, but industry backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, etc. So the flavor of what you get in this environment is pretty deep and rich time and time again. From time to time, people ask the question, well, is this only for profit-making institutions? And our answer is an unequivocal no. Willie and I do a lot of consulting. We've applied this methodology, strategic learning, across a number of different profit-making industries, but a number of different not-for-profit organizations. The motivations of a not-for-profit, in many respects, are not much different from for-profit organizations. You have a vision, you have goals and objectives, and in order to actually deliver on that vision, you need to find a way to drive some level of profit, or as they'll call it, surplus in your organization, so you can reinvest it back into your mission or vision of your organization. That applies for for-profits and not-for-profits as well. So all of these principles that we teach apply to both of those types of organizations. It's a practical and valuable process. You know, I always say this even in the courses. Having come from the practitioner's side of things, what I love about Willie's methodology that he conceived, strategic learning, is one which is thorough and complete, yet it doesn't weigh you down in strategy development in a cumbersome way. It gets you from strategy development to execution in an effective, efficient way. And as operators of organizations, that's what we're all about. We're getting paid to show results in the marketplace. What I like about this is you don't wane in the process. It's a very efficient and effective methodology. The terminology that is used is very much from an operator's perspective, and it's very, very productive at the end of it. So I think you'd find that to be very, very helpful also, and maybe soothing in terms of what your appetite is. And I'd like to just end by saying that the methodology has been road-tested deeply and broadly, and I mentioned this earlier, not just for for-profits and not-for-profits, also for Fortune 500 companies. It's been embedded as a methodology used throughout the organizations, but also has been used and embedded in numerous startup organizations, technology startups, et cetera, that are small organizations, but the principles apply and are broadly used across all kinds of domains. So I'd invite you to join us. I think Gershom is going to talk a little bit about the when and how if you are interested, and we'd love to see you there. Gershom?
Thank you so much, both Professor Willie Pietersen and Professor Peter Meola, for taking the time to join us today. Everyone, and thank you for everyone in the audience for taking the time to join us today. You can hear more from both of these professors in our course, Creating and Executing Breakthrough Strategy, that they've talked about a lot, which runs this year from June 5th to June 10th this summer, and then again in the fall. You can see the dates and apply and contact people here at our website, www.gsb.columbia.edu/execed to learn more. Thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for joining, and thank you again, Willie and Peter, for taking the time out to share with us today.
Thank you all. Lots of good luck.